What's up, humans? Let's talk about goals. Goals are great things to set. They should motivate you into getting shit done. I used to have a buddy that used to tell me all the time, seriously, dude, I'm going to save my money and buy a little plot of land up in the mountains, and I'm going to start splicing plants and make some Killbud. Well, let's look at goals from a different perspective. This is Stories from a Different Perspective by J.L. Sweeney, as told by Argus Trewin. I am Argus Trewin. Story number 5, Killbud. He would get that promotion after all. Smiling slyly, he blew the whistle and watched as Malachi wheeled around and began to slink back to the van. Justin hadn't deserved to be night manager, and Kevin was sure that Justin had told Lucas that Kevin smoked pot. Pot. Pot! It was a 3-letter word. 2.5 years at MIT down the drain thanks to a 3-letter word. He chuckled to himself. It wasn't the word itself, but the green plant that had been associated with it. "Hurry up, Malachi," Kevin whispered harshly. The plant climbed jerkily into the open side door of the van. Kevin gave it a soft, loving hand up and closed the door behind it. He would check it later to make sure it had cleaned itself. He jumped in the driver's seat and drove calmly away from 708 15th Avenue. As he drove, he lit the fatty he had rolled for the ride home. Inhaling deeply and blowing the smoke back at Malachi, he let his mind go over his pending promotion. He would change a few things, and that would cause some waves, but he knew that as soon as the crew saw how much easier things worked, they wouldn't be upset anymore. "Starting with that bitch Sandy," he muttered, and grinned wickedly. Justin's squeeze had caused all sorts of hassle on the night shift, and he was fed up with it. "I'll fire her ass exactly 2 minutes after they give me the promotion," he thought. No more of that sassy crap out of her conceited little mouth. He hated the pouty looks he hated the snotty looks that she gave everyone, and really hated her pouting lips, especially when all they spewed was derogatory crap about everyone else. Depending on how much of a fight she put up, he might just introduce her to Malachi too. Then her and her punk-ass boyfriend could digest together. He looked up and was surprised to find himself pulling into his front yard. "Whew! I've almost outdone myself this time," he thought, shaking his head to clear it. "Can't remember a thing about the drive home except thinking about work. And it's a 45-minute drive from the other side of town. Better not smoke this stuff again while I'm driving." He smiled, put the van in park, and got out to let Malachi out. He opened the side door, and Malachi shook his branches. Kevin blew his whistle, and Malachi climbed down out of the van. He gave the plant a loving rub and a kiss, and then after plucking a large bud from Malachi's upper branches, turned and headed toward the cabin. Malachi waited for a moment and then shuffled toward the forest. He could sense the others and was anxious to get back and share his meal with them. Inside the cabin, Kevin took off his shoes and socks and sat down on his lazy boy. He was going to make a huge profit off of this batch. Closing his eyes to let his mind wander, it wasn't long before he fell asleep and was sailing along on the wings of his dreams. He saw himself 5.5 years ago at MIT. He had been fascinated by genetics in high school and had excelled in science and math. He worked hard, persuaded the right people, and was accepted at MIT for the fall semester straight out of high school. No class was too difficult for him, and he was well on his way to becoming one of the greatest geneticists ever. He always had new and intriguing ideas of how testing and research should be done. At the head of his class after 2.5 years, he saw himself hook up with Summer. A blonde with a beautiful smile and a great personality, combined with an almost genius intelligence, danced into view. She smiled at him as he flew past his old dorm building. He veered right and saw dark clouds boiling in the sky above the building containing the office of the Dean of Students. Peeking in the dean's window, he saw himself receiving his dismissal. Tears streamed down his face, but there had been no pity in the eyes of the dean. Again he saw Summer. This time she was dancing down the hallway away from the dean's office. He flew away from the window as fast as he could, not wanting to hear the words that Dean had hurled at him as he left the office. Knowing where he would see Summer next, he flew to the archive. He landed lightly in front of the door just as it opened, revealing a kick-ass party going on inside. Music blared and lights flashed happily. It was a warm, inviting place. He entered, and people began to wave and call him by name. Summer was sitting at her usual booth. She smiled as he walked up. It wasn't a happy to see you smile either. It was a I just got your ass kicked out of school and I'm happy about it smile. There could be only one top student, and she had wanted to be in that position all along. I guess you'll be leaving echoed in his mind, along with her evil, life-destroying laugh. He had thought she cared about him, but it was only being first that she had wanted. Kevin was the only person who had stood in her way of a life of continuous scientific grants and funding. Only the very top student in each class received the Hensel Award. It was a presidential appointment to the Hensel Institute, where funding was unlimited and the scientists lived like kings. The others were waiting impatiently and began rustling leaves and branches in unison as Malachi lurched into the clearing. Soon they were gathered around in a circle, feasting on the flesh that Malachi had regurgitated. It was the first time they had tasted human. Each plant slurped and chomped greedily. They were slightly disappointed when it was all gone, but they knew it wouldn't be long before they would get more. The next day went slow for Kevin. He was anxious to get to work and get promoted. That extra $3.67 would add up, and he would be able to buy some land of his own. He was getting tired of living in the cabin on his uncle's ranch. When he had his own place, he would be able to set up a real lab and get down to some intense experimentations. Sighing loudly, he decided to go feed the plants. He went outside and began dragging a deer carcass toward the clearing. It was a little over 100 yards away, and he would be tired by the time he got there, but he would do almost anything for his beloved plants. Hauling the carcass into the clearing, he dropped it near the center and pulled out his whistle. He blew on it, and almost immediately plants began to slither out of the forest from all directions, converging on the center of the clearing. Soon they stood in a small semicircle around the deer, swaying back and forth, but making no move to eat it. Kevin blew the whistle again, and the plants began to inch forward and bloom. As each plant blossomed, it revealed rows of jagged teeth, somewhat like those of a shark. They weren't actually teeth, but sharp, needle-like thorns that resembled teeth. The plants began to rip chunks of flesh off the deer, and while some swallowed the meat whole, others chewed, making a horribly squishy noise. Kevin stood back and watched. They never failed to amaze him. They were his babies, and he loved them more than he did humans. To them, he was their father, their master, their creator. In their own way, they both loved and feared him. They would do as he commanded. Kevin's uncle had been kind enough to let him stay in the cabin on his ranch after his dismissal from MIT. His parents would not speak to him, and he had nowhere else to go. He didn't mind staying out in the country, since it was peaceful and there was no one to bother him. Town was only 6 miles away, and he had gotten a job at a local fast food restaurant. That was 2 years ago. Since then, he had worked his way up and was in line for a promotion. It wasn't the money. He was making plenty of money selling his merchandise. But the sense of accomplishment in earning a management position, even if it was just a fast food restaurant. He really wanted that promotion to prove to his parents that he wasn't a failure. Then along came Justin and Sandy, transferring in from the big city 30 miles away. Sandy had been mugged and had wanted to get away from the city. That punk Justin had heard of the manager opening and had transferred, bringing Sandy with him and swindling Lucas into hiring her too. Justin had as much time and experience as Kevin, but was 4 years older. Lucas decided to give him the promotion due to his age. Kevin didn't go ballistic right there in the office. He had kept his face emotionless, nodded his head, and left the room. Justin followed behind him and stopped at the door. With an arrogant look on his face, he opened the door for Kevin and said, "No hard feelings?" "None," Kevin replied and walked away. Didn't it just figure? It almost seemed like he was back at MIT with Summer. Summer was a sly little Oregon girl who, for the amount of marijuana she had smoked, was incredibly intelligent. As interested in nature and science, in nature and science had taken her down a path very similar to that of Kevin's. She had seen him in classes and around campus and had listened very carefully to the things he had said. She knew that he was going to be her toughest competitor for top honors. After their second year, she decided to get close to him and perhaps somehow sabotage him. She never thought to ask him if he even cared about the Hensel. In fact, Kevin had no desire for the award. He was just doing the best he could, just as he had promised himself he would when he was accepted to MIT. Summer had crushed his life and his dreams for no reason. Funny how that happens so often in life. The fall of their third year rolled around, and she had decided that she needed to make her move soon, as Kevin was beginning to be noticed by some of the more prominent faculty. She would see him laughing and joking with the chair of the genetics division, and it would set her blood to boiling. One evening in October, she set her plans into motion. She followed him to the archive and waited until he took a table. She ordered 4 mind erasers and sent them to him. She waited and arrived at the same time the drinks did. "I'm Summer," she said, and flopped down next to him. They drank together the rest of the night and told each other their life stories. Hers, of course, was partially made up. They met again the next night, and again the next. They were going steady by the end of the week and were inseparable. Kevin thought that if she had been an actress, she would have won an Oscar for her performance. She took him home to Oregon in November for Thanksgiving, and that's when she had introduced him to the 3-letter word that would help her destroy his life. After a fine feast, she took him for a long walk in the forest near her family's home. She told him that she wanted to show him something. It wasn't long before they came to a huge tree with a ladder nailed to it. She climbed up and he followed. Summer lit a lantern and tuned a radio to a soft music station. Kevin had never seen such a large tree house and wandered around, looking out into the forest in every direction. Summer unrolled a sandwich bag, took something out of it, and loaded it into a small pipe. Kevin could smell the strong odor, but could not identify it. He had never been around marijuana, had never been around any people that had been around it. She smiled at him and offered him the pipe. He felt his heart speed up and knew that if he did as she asked, he could have her tonight. He smoked. After his coughing stopped, they kissed. She smoked. They kissed again. He smoked again, and they quickly took each other's clothes off. He thought it was the most magical moment of his life. She forced herself to do it, knowing all along that she had won. After they returned to school, she made him smoke daily. He didn't mind, since it got him the sex he wanted, and he felt that it expanded his mind. He also really enjoyed laughing at silly things, but he would never tell her that. Then she set him up. She called him one night and told him to get things ready because she would be over soon. "Get the pipe out and take a few hits before I get there. It will get you warmed up for when I have plans," she whispered huskily over the phone. Kevin's hands shook as he smoked. She had sounded so sexy on the phone, and he thought he was in for a special night. He was just lighting the pipe again when there was a knock at the door. Smiling, he opened the door with the pipe in his hands and stared right into the faces of 2 police officers. He was charged with possession, and the newspapers had a heyday. MIT officials hated scandals, and Kevin was quickly expelled. It felt like his life was over until he saw Summer sitting in their booth. Then he knew he had a mission to fulfill. One day, he would get her back, even if it was the last thing on earth that he ever did. He left MIT with his life in shambles and the sound of her horrible laugh ringing in his ears. 4:30 rolled around, and Kevin had to leave for work. He had watched the plants finish the deer and sent them back into the forest to hide. The drive to work didn't take long, and he could see Lucas staring at him through the office window as he pulled into the parking lot. Kevin headed for the employee entrance and found Lucas waiting for him inside. Lucas motioned him into the office and closed the door. "Justin didn't come in for work this morning and doesn't answer his phone. I drove over there and knocked, but no one answered the door. His car is there, but no Justin." "He didn't leave with Sandy, did he?" Lucas asked. "No clue. Not my day to watch him," Kevin shrugged. "Don't be a smart-ass, Kevin. I don't have time to put up with this. If he isn't in by Saturday, you get the night manager spot. Now get your ass to work," Lucas growled at him. Kevin turned and smiled. 2 more days and it would be his. He didn't see Justin's disappearance as dirty play. In his opinion, he had worked for it and earned that promotion, and no one was going to prevent it. It wasn't fair for him to have worked this hard just to be denied his goal. He had suffered once, and he had vowed never to suffer again. When he got home that night, Kevin packaged up the last of his genetically enhanced weed and chuckled. He could ask $8 grand for this half-pound, and he knew that after it was sampled, he would get it. He had been steadily increasing his price over the last couple of months, and his merchandise was always worth it. He wanted to hurry up and buy his own land so he could build his lab. He smiled to himself. 2 more batches and I can put a down payment on that 25 acres I've been looking at. Time was on his side. He had not been idle after his dismissal from MIT. He had gotten his job quickly and saved his money. There was a rundown barn out near the cabin, and he was able to set up a small lab inside of it. It took time, but he was able to scrounge and buy the equipment he needed and was soon hard at work. He knew that sooner or later, one of his wild ideas would work, and he would have created something that the world had never seen. Time went by, and he had a fair share of success and failure. He could have made money legally since he had invented a liquid miracle grow that actually worked. Plants could grow from seed to full maturity in just a few days, but he chose not to because he felt that his greatest breakthrough was the marijuana plants he grew. He had experimented with different types and had come up with an especially strong hybrid. Each generation was more potent than the last, and it only took a week for a new generation to grow after splicing. Kevin was a genius at genetic splicing and was finally creating plants that no one had ever heard of or even thought of. His first test had been with a rose and a lilac bush. What he came out with was a bush that had flowered huge roses whose perfume was nearly overwhelming. In time, his experiments became more daring and exotic. He considered Malachi to be his greatest accomplishment, a hybrid plant containing his enhanced marijuana, rose, primate, dolphin, Venus flytrap, giant honeydew, and climbing ivy DNA. What Kevin had gotten was much more than he had actually bargained for. He had spliced the genes and had applied his growth formula and gone to bed. 2 days later, as he approached the barn door, he noticed that a plant tendril had wrapped around the door handle and was pulling and tugging to get it open. He slowly and carefully unwrapped the tendril and opened the door. Before him stood a plant about 4.5 feet tall and about 3 feet in diameter. It swayed back and forth on its soft lower branches and was slowly opening and closing its bud. Kevin could smell its enticing aroma but kept his distance. At that moment, his uncle rode up on horseback and asked Kevin if he had seen his dogs. Kevin shook his head and his uncle blew hard on a dog whistle. The sound of leaves shaking came from inside the barn, and Kevin looked back through the door. The plant had closed its bud and had moved back away from the door. Cussing about stupid dogs, his uncle rode off, leaving him alone with the plant. Kevin entered the barn and shut the door. The plant had backed up against the far wall and stood there shaking. Kevin noticed that there was blood on the floor, and as he looked closer, he noticed that there were dogs' legs being held by the tendrils of the plant. Realization and pride exploded in Kevin's heart and soul. Here was his genius. Here was his incredible discovery that would very soon get him even with Summer. Kevin didn't know how or why the plants reacted to a dog whistle, but he used it to his advantage. What should have been totally impossible had been done. He had trained his creations. They could do simple things and reacted to a variety of notes from the silent whistle. 3 short tweets was a signal to eat. 1 short and 1 long directed them to come to the clearing. 2 short and 1 long meant for them to follow him. They had not been aggressive in the beginning when he had been feeding them dog food, but as they grew, they needed more to eat, and he had begun to feed them hamburger with the dog food. After that, their aura seemed to change. They weren't cuddly little plants anymore. They were adult plants and had to be watched. He once had to destroy one that tried to attack him. Every hour spent not working at the restaurant or experimenting was spent training the plants. Within weeks they were full grown, most of them standing between 3.5 to 4 feet in height and measuring 3 to 5 feet around. When dormant, they looked like extremely large versions of whatever plants Kevin had spliced into them. When he blew too short and too long notes on the whistle, they bloomed and were active and able to move across the ground. Their appetite had grown with them, and at one point Kevin had to use some of his savings to buy a cow. Luckily, it took quite a while for their meals to digest, so he didn't have to feed them often. Sandy came back Friday night. No one had seen Justin, and Lucas had called the police. Sandy was in Lucas' office when Kevin got to work that night. She was crying, but Kevin didn't care. He felt that justice had been served. "You're on probationary period starting right now," Lucas said. "But if Justin comes back or if you screw up, I'll put you back where you were. Now get to work." Kevin nodded and went to work. Sandy watched him closely for a few hours, but he gave no sign that he knew anything. He is so creepy, she thought. He doesn't even care that Justin might be dead. How can someone be like that? She left and drove home. As she pulled into the driveway, her lights flashed across something white in the bushes near the steps. She parked and went to see what it was, thinking it was probably just the newspaper. As she got closer, she could tell that it was a shoe. It looked like one of Justin's shoes, so she picked it up. It felt slightly heavy. She turned the porch light on, and her stomach convulsed. Vomit flew from her lips as she dropped the shoe and lurched away from the porch. She fell down in the soft grass and cried. She lay there for 30 minutes and then got pissed. Angrily, she picked up the shoe, making sure not to look at the torn, bloody flesh of the foot that remained within it, got into her car, and drove to the restaurant. Parking across the street, she turned off the motor and waited. Kevin would be finished closing in 15 minutes or so, and she had made up her mind to follow him home and check out his place. She knew that people who did this type of thing in movies usually ended up getting killed, but she was going to risk it. In her opinion, she was tough enough to kick Kevin's ass any day. Kevin locked the restaurant doors and went to his van. He got in, surveyed the surroundings, noticed Sandy's car, and lit a joint. He reminded himself not to take more than one hit, or he might not make it home. Inhaling deeply and smiling to himself, he pulled out and headed out of town. Across the street, Sandy ground her teeth together. She had figured that bastard Kevin was a pothead, and now she had proof. She had just had to figure out how to get him caught. Kevin knew that she was following him immediately after leaving the town limits. Traffic was rare heading out this direction at this time of night. He chuckled. "Nosy little bitch," he smirked through clenched teeth. "Oh well, I don't see why they can't have some dessert." He rolled his window down as he turned onto the dirt road that led up to his cabin, stuck his head out, and blew the whistle. Shutting her lights off, Sandy turned and followed the van up the dirt road. Halfway up the drive, she pulled over and got out. Jogging up the road, she stopped near the edge of the clearing where the cabin was located. It was probably 80 yards from the end of the road to the cabin. She watched as Kevin got out of his van and went inside. Sandy took a deep breath and trotted around the perimeter of the clearing until she neared the cabin. Slowly, she went to a window and peeked in. She couldn't see Kevin, so she tiptoed quietly toward the back. Easing her head around the corner, she saw Kevin walk in the back door. She made her way through the trees and bushes to the door and looked in. Her heart froze as she saw Kevin standing there staring out at her. She turned to run and heard him yell, "Stop!" She did so and turned around. There was no fear in her eyes, only the glowing sparks of hatred. Kevin saw this and almost felt pity for her until she opened her mouth. "You killed him, didn't you?" she asked. "You did, didn't you, you ugly bastard? I'll watch you fry in the electric chair, you son of a bitch," she shouted. He started laughing, and she charged him. He easily caught her flailing arms and shoved her backward. She started forward again, but felt her sweater snag on something. She looked down and saw that it was lodged in the bud of some strange-looking plant. She looked up and saw Kevin blowing on something. "It must be a dog whistle," she thought. "The chicken shit is calling his dogs on me." She gave a jerk on her sweater, but couldn't get it loose. Then she felt the first of many flesh-ripping pains that would end in oblivion. Kevin had given the plants the signal to eat. They had closed in on her slowly while she had been yelling at Kevin. Now they tore softball-sized chunks of meat from her body. She screamed and tried to run, but the major parts of her leg muscles had already been ripped out. She sprawled face first and could hear the rustling of their branches as they grouped around her. She was nearing the point of hyperventilation when Kevin peered over the tops of the plants at her. She spit at him. Panic transformed into rage, and she rolled over and tried to get up. She fell and lay still. "Bye-bye," Kevin snickered sarcastically. He blew the whistle again, and the plants returned to their meal. Her cries of no became softer and were soon muffled by the squishing, chewing noises of the plants. Within an hour, not a trace remained that she was ever there. Kevin put gloves on, removed the shoe from her car, and drove it back to town, dropping it off at Justin's house. No one had seen him, and there was no evidence to prove otherwise. He smiled and enjoyed the long walk home. The phone rang again. He thought he had knocked it off the hook the first time, but had evidently missed. He grabbed it and grunted. "Get your ass to work, Kevin," Lucas shouted over the phone. "I need you for this lunch rush. There's a convention in the park, and we're being swamped. By the way, the night manager spot is yours permanently. Justin hasn't shown up, so you get it. Now hurry up." Lucas hung up the phone and shook his head. Kevin was a little weird, but he did a good job, and he rarely complained. Lucas couldn't wait until he could transfer out himself. He didn't like most of his employees and was ready for a taste of the big city life. Kevin rolled over and began laughing. "I did it. I got the promotion. Now maybe I'll get a little respect around here." He hummed happily to himself as he showered and got dressed. It might be a little too soon, but he decided he would send Summer her birthday present anyway. He could drop it off at the post office when he went to work. Grabbing his keys, he left the cabin and went to the barn. He unlocked the door and went directly to the grow lamps. A red tulip stood tall in a large clay pot. He blew the whistle, and it closed its bud. He blew again, and it opened. He ran it through its commands, and it went 8 for 8. He grinned and gave the tulip a handful of raw hamburger filled with Miracle-Gro. Then he carefully boxed and wrapped the plant, preparing it for its trip. He daydreamed as he drove into town. The restaurant was his at night to do with as he pleased. What goals would he set? He wasn't even sure himself, but he knew that he could do whatever he set his mind to. The plants were proof of that. It cost him $26.11 to send his gift, but he considered it money well spent. Grumbling about mail prices, he drove to work, ready to assume his new position. Any package was a good package, as long as postage was paid, Summers thought as she signed for the box. There was no return address, but it had only taken 2 days to get here from the Spokane, Washington postmark. "Oh well, I'll figure it out later," she said to herself as she unwrapped the box. A card fell out and she opened it. Strange, she thought. All it says is happy birthday. It was unsigned. It must be from someone who knows I love surprises, she giggled. She opened the box and leaves sprung out at her. Startled, she backed away from the box, but seeing no danger, opened it the rest of the way. There before her stood a large plant with a beautiful, deep green color to its stem and leaves. Dangling from the bud was a cassette tape tied on with a small red ribbon. She opened the tape box and took the tape out. "Play me and pet the plant," were the only words typewritten on the tape. Summer shrugged and popped the tape into her stereo. She hit play and went over to the plant. No sound came from the speakers, but the plant began to shake its leaves. She started petting the plant as directed, then the bud bloomed full and beautiful. The scent of a flower-filled summer afternoon filled the room. The tulip was her favorite flower, but she had never seen one that was this lovely. There was still no sound from the stereo, and she continued to caress the flower. It began to sway back and forth, and its scent was hypnotic. Summer closed her eyes, put her face into the middle of the flower, and inhaled deeply through her nose. Kicking off his shoes, Kevin sighed and lit one of his specials. He inhaled and coughed. "Damn," he choked. "Good old Malachi just keeps getting better and better." His first night as manager had gone by wonderfully. He had a crew that he could work with, and if couldn't, well, he'd just fire them and hire someone else. Yep, it won't be long now, he yawned, and drifted off to sleep. And that's the end of the first 5 stories from a Different Perspective. Good feedback. We'll bring you some more humans. Kill it.
Hell yeah.
I used to have a buddy, and he used to say to me, one of these days, I'm going to save my money, and I'm going to buy a little plot of land in the mountains, and I'm going to start splicing plants, and I'm going to make some killer bud. Well, that buddy never got to do that. Hopefully he's smashing heads in Valhalla. This is Stories from a Different Perspective by J.L. Sweeney, as told by Argus Trewin. I am Argus Trewin.